Every negotiable instrument eventually reaches one defining moment, the day payment becomes due. But what happens when the debtor arrives ready to pay and the person entitled to enforce the instrument refuses to accept it? Under UCC Section 3-603, the law has an answer. Tender simply means an actual offer to pay, not a promise, not an intention, not "I'll pay later." Tender is the present ability and willingness to satisfy an obligation by offering payment to the person legally entitled to enforce the instrument. Subsection A establishes an important rule. When payment is properly offered, its legal effect follows the same principles that govern tender under ordinary contract law. In other words, the Uniform Commercial Code doesn't reinvent the doctrine. It relies upon long-established principles of contract law to determine what happens after a valid tender is made. Now comes the turning point. Payment is offered to the person entitled to enforce the instrument. But instead of accepting it, the payment is rejected. That single decision changes legal consequences. Subsection B protects certain secondary parties. If proper payment is tendered and refused, an endorser or an accommodation party who would otherwise have a right of recourse is discharged to the extent of the amount tendered. The law recognizes they should not continue bearing liability when payment was already properly offered. A creditor cannot reject valid payment and then continue increasing another party's exposure for that same amount. The law prevents unnecessary penalties when the debtor has already done what the law required. Subsection C creates another powerful consequence. When payment is properly tendered, the obligor's responsibility for future interest on the amount tendered comes to an end. Even if the money is refused, interest does not continue accumulating on that amount. Sometimes, the instrument requires presentment. If the obligor is ready, able, and waiting at every designated place of payment on the due date, the law treats that readiness as though payment had actually been tendered. Even without physical delivery, the Uniform Commercial Code recognizes constructive tender. When every legal requirement is satisfied and the obligor stands ready to pay, the law deems tender to have been made. UCC Section 3-603 teaches 4 essential principles. First, tender is a genuine offer to pay made to the person entitled to enforce the instrument. Second, if that payment is refused, certain endorsers and accommodation parties may be discharged to the extent of the tender. Third, future interest on the amount properly tendered no longer accrues after the due date. And finally, when the obligor is able, ready, and waiting to pay where the instrument requires, the law may treat that readiness as if tender itself had already occurred. Because under the Uniform Commercial Code, sometimes the legal effect depends not on whether payment was accepted, but on whether payment was properly offered.